All right, I will say good morning, a good tavach. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sarah Walaski, for dedicating all the Shirman Roshos this month in the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira. The Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Droshos this month. With much hatzlacha to all of the shir attendees, Halavai Yishal Abizoch Eretz Hashem to celebrate many simchas in the coming year ahead, and to thank Shandi and Avram Kelman for dedicating all the Shirman Roshos this month in memory of their beloved parents and in the schus of all those who need a refuah shleima. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin, on the occasion of the yahrzeit of Baruch Meir's grandmother, Sarah Chana Bas Beryl Nochum, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, families in Nechama, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. So I will say, so today's daf is Yud Dal. Hopefully you did. I assigned a little bit of homework last night in the WhatsApp chat, just a little bit. We just had to finish up the sugya, ultimately again, of the sugya of the last two dots, of the ability of a woman to be kona es atzma, to, so to speak, reacquire herself back with the death of her husband, as well as with a get. And with that, we're actually starting on the last line of Yud Gimel Amud Beis, last two lines, 13b at the two dots. We had an incredible Gemara yesterday, and in Meretz Hashem we'll have similarly incredible Gemara today as well. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah said as follows, Vayivama niknis bebiyah. So remember again, a Yivama ultimately again is niknis, ultimately is acquired, and Rabbi say again, keep saying, I've said it many times, remember the lashon of kinyan over here is not meant in the classic lashon of kinyan where one party acquires ownership over something else. Remember again, because that's not what marriage is. The marital union does not work that way. Neither spouse acquires the other. Remember again, this goes back to Beis Amud Aleph. Why does the Mishnah use the lashon of kinyan? Because since the Mishnah is coming to introduce us to kesef, right? It's a concept that Kiddushin can be affected through kesef, and kesef ikri kinyan. Therefore, the Mishnah uses the lashon of kinyan. Very important point to keep highlighting. In any event, so the Mishnah says as follows: as the Mishnah says, that Yivama is niknis bebiyah. So when it says bebiyah minalim, how do we know that a Yivama, that a Yibum relationship, right? The Yivama. So also remember again, Reuben's married to Rachel. Reuben dies without children. Reuben has a brother Shimon. There is a mitzvah of Yibum that Shimon has an obligation to go ahead and marry his sister-in-law. How is that Yibum relationship created? Through Biyah. So where do we know this from? Amar, the pasuk says, top of Yud Dalid, Yavamo Yavo Allah Ulekachalo Liisha. Okay, so we'll say it's pretty straight out. The pasuk says the Yavama, ultimately the Yavam, Shimon will have relations with his sister-in-law, with Rachel, right? Ulekachalo Liisha, and ultimately again through Biyah, she becomes his wife. Well, pretty explicit. Ve'ema lekula milsa. So maybe we'll say maybe when the Torah says Ulekachalo Liisha, maybe what the pasuk is actually saying is that all of the avenues available to a typical Kiddushin or available to a typical marriage are available to Yibum as well. L'kachalo l'isha means the Yavam is marrying this woman as a wife. And therefore the same way that generally a wife can be acquired with kesef, shtar, and biyah, so too Yavama can be acquired with kesef, shtar, and biyah. Rashi says over here, v'dil makisha, it's the first line in Rashi, v'dil makisha, ma'isha kesef u'shtar ki biyah, just like by a regular woman, kesef and shtar work the same way as biyah, af Yavama, kesef u'shtar ki biyah. So to Yavama, kesef is that should work as biyah as well. To which the Gemara says, "Lo sagdaitcha desanya yachol yu kesef v'shtar gomra kiderch she'abiyah gomer espa." So we'll say the Gemara in fact asked this question. You might have thought that kesef and shtar should be able to create a yibum marriage in the same way that biyah does. Talmud lomar v'yibma. So we'll say the pasuk says v'yibma. Ultimately, again, which I will say ultimately means, he says the phrase is Yavama Yava Ulakachalo Liisha V'yibma. So Rashi says over here V'yibma Bia Mashma. So lashon of V'yibma itself is a lashon, a connotation of Bia. So therefore V'yibma teaches us Bia Gomeres Ba Vein Kesef Ushtar Gomrin Ba. Therefore, again, I will say the lashon of V'yibma or the word V'yibma teaches us that it is Dafka Bia. Oh, sorry. Okay. This dafka bia, ultimately again, that affects the relationship and not kesef and shtar. I ve'ema vai v'yibma. We'll say maybe v'yibma comes to teach something different. The Baal Karcha miyabim. So I'll say maybe Lashon of the Yibma comes to teach me. It's an interesting halacha that even Baal Karcha, right? The halacha l'maaseh will say what happens if Shimon, the surviving brother, violates Rachel. So ultimately, again, even though it's Baal Karcha, technically speaking, the Yibam relationship has been affected. V'yibma the Baal Karcha miyibam. So we'll say, so maybe v'yibma. Remember again, we're just trying to go back and forth over here because just follow the progression of the drasha. From Yivama Yavo Aleha, the Gemara wanted to use that as the source. Ultimately, that bia is kona bayibam. The problem is the end of that phrase ulakachalo liisha sounds like a yivama is a full-fledged wife, which she is. If she's a full-fledged wife, then maybe all of the avenues of kiddushin should be open to the yavam, kasef and shtar, not just bia. To which the Gemara answers v'yibma. V'yibma comes to teach me that no, it's dafka bia gomeres ba. I says Gemara 1 second. V'yibma comes to teach me something different. What does v'yibma come to teach me? That ultimately, again, Baal Karcha, that even if he violates her, right, even if it's Baal Karcha, the Yibam relationship has still been affected. Im kein leima kra v'yavam, or v'yibim, my v'yibma, shamas mina tarti. So Rabbi say, remember again, we see this type of drasha many times, where the Torah could have written a word in a shortened form, but instead choose to write it in an elongated form. It opens it up for a double drasha. A drasha from the word itself, and then a drasha from the elongated form of the word. So that's what's happening over here as well. V'yibma could have been just written as v'yibim. The fact that it's written in an elongated form opens it up for two drashas. What are the two drashas? Number one, that yibam is only affected through bia. That's number one. And number two, that even if that bia took place Baal Karcha, ultimately, again, it is still effective. Interesting. All right, let's go back to Bechalitza. And we'll say, then the Mishnah went on and said that a Yivama is Kona es Atzma, right? She acquires herself either through Chalitza or through the death of the Yavam. So Bechalitza, how do we know that Chalitza effectively ends the union? Minalan dichsev v'nikra shmo b'Yisrael Beis Chalutz Hanal. Because what's the Torah, after describing the process of Chalitza, says that the Yavam's name, right, he will be known within Klal Yisrael as the house of the removed shoe. Okay, what do you learn from that? Kevan shechalatz banal, once she removes his shoe, hutra l'chol Yisrael. She becomes permitted to everyone else. So from here you see that Chalitza is what allows her, so to speak, to acquire herself back. To which the Gemara says, Hi Yisrael, l'hachiyuda asa. So we'll say, so what's very interesting over here is, the ikar of this drasha really is, v'nikra shmo b'Yisrael. Why does that say v'nikra shmo b'Yisrael? So the Gemara is darshaning, because once Chalitza takes place, she is muteres l'kol Yisrael. She's muteres to everyone. So you see from here that Chalitza permits her. Chalitza, so to speak, allows her to reacquire herself. Says, really? Is that what the Yisrael comes for? The Gemara says, Haimi bari lechidisanyo, lechiditani Rabbi Shmuel bar Yehuda. So I'll say, that actually is required for a different halacha. Rabbi Shmuel bar Yehuda says, what does Bi Yisrael teach us? Bebezdin shal Yisrael, v'lo bebezdin shal ovdei kochavim. That Chalitza can only be affected ultimately again in a Beis Din of Yisrael, of Jews, and not of Gentiles. Now I will say, that itself is a fascinating idea, that what would be the Havamina, that Chalitza could be. In general, I will say we have the concept of Elam Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem. We have a concept that the right Torah says, these are the laws you shall place before them. And again, Rashi HaKadosh brings down, he says, V'lo bifnei ovdei kochavim. That in general, whenever we have a legal matter, right, the first stop of a Jew to address a legal matter is in Beis Din, it's not in secular courts. So what's the pshat of it? I need a special drasha to teach you that Chalitza can only happen in a court of Jews. So we'll say, if you notice, by the way, on the margin over here, the Bach changes the girsa. And the Bach says over here, V'lo bebeis din shel gerim. Interesting. The Bach says B'Yisrael is not coming to exclude a court of non-Jews. You don't need an exclusion for that. It's coming to exclude a court made up of converts. That even though a ger, right, we'll say a ger is a full-fledged Jew, right? And again, a ger could absolutely sit on a Beis Din. there's a Gzeres HaKosav seems to be for Chalitza, that the Beis Din for Chalitza cannot be comprised of Jews who are Gerim. B'Yisrael means they have to be Jews who were born Jews. Fascinating drasha. So Gemara goes weiter. So the point over here is that Yisrael is not available to teach me the original drasha that she becomes permitted to everyone through Chalitza. It's used in a very specific way to teach me that the Beis Din which oversees the Chalitza process cannot be comprised of Gerim. To which the Gemara says, Trey B'Yisrael Ksivi. The word Yisrael is written twice in the context, ultimately, again, of Yibum. So, of Chalitza, sorry. So one Yisrael is coming to teach me that it's a Beis Din only of Jews who are born Jews. And one is coming to teach me that Halacha L'maisa, Chalitza permits her to everyone else. Incredible. But still, we need it for the following drasha. Rabbi Yehuda, Pam Achas Hayinu Yoshim with Rabbi Tarfon. One time we were sitting in front of Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ubasa Yivama Lachlots. And a Yivama came to do Chalitza. Right? Va'amra lanu, and ultimately again, so they did the Chalitza process. And Rabbi Tarfon says, Rabbi Yehuda said to us, Anu kulchem va'amru chalutz hanal. And Rabbi Yehuda made the Beis Din, repeat, chalutz hanal. So the Gemara is suggesting over here that the pasuk that we're quoting of v'nikra shmo b'Yisrael Beis Chalutz Hanal means that what? That as part of the Chalitza process, the Beis Din has to actually call out the instructions. Chalutz Hanal, that's the pasuk he's used for. To which the Gemara says, no, hahu me v'nikra shmo nafka. We'll say that's the Einachinam is not from the pasuk, but it's not from the pasuk of v'nikra shmo. They will call out his name. So we learn out from here that the Beis Din actually has to call out Chalutz Hanal. So therefore, we'll say if you bring this all together, so it turns out the Mishnah tells us that the Yavama acquires herself back with Chalitza. Where do we know that from? We know that from the pasuk of v'nikra shmo b'Yisrael Beis Chalutz Hanal. Dafka from Yisrael teaches us that halacha l'maisa again, that once she does chalitza, she becomes permitted to call Yisrael. There's a second Yisrael. What does the second Yisrael teach me? That the Beis Din ultimately, that adjudicates, that oversees the chalitza process, has to be a Beis Din of Jews who are born Jews and not of Gerim. Furthermore, the phrase of v'nikra shmo teaches us that there are certain parts of the chalitza process that the Beis Din itself must say out loud. Incredible. All of these drashas in one pasuk. Let's go weiter. Furthermore, again, a Yavama acquires herself back through the death of the Yavam. Why, if the Yavam dies, then ultimately, again, she is no longer bound to him, obviously. She acquires herself back. So the Gemara says, Minalan, from where do I know that? Kal v'chomer. We'll say, so that is a kal v'chomer. Right, so what's the kal v'chomer? Uma ishes ish she bechenek. So remember again, we saw this before actually by our whole sugi of nara amurasa. So ishes ish, stam adultery. Right, stam regular, whatever. Adultery, right? Adultery is punishable by chenek, by strangulation. So ma ishes ish shehi bechenek. So misas habal matirasa. So we'll say, so again, you have a typical married couple, Reuven and Rachel. So if another man were to have relations with Rachel, ultimately, again, it'd be punishable by chenek. Okay? Yet, when Reuven died, which is a severe penalty, right? One of the Arba Misas Beis Din. So a severe penalty. Yet, death of the husband permits Rachel. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That death of a husband permits a serious transgression. Right? Or not permits, removes a serious transgression. Yivama shehibalav. Now both say Yivama. Now remember again, let's go back, right? What's the Yivama? So Yivama is a woman waiting for Yibum. So both say if she has relations with someone, she has relations who is not her Yavam. Again, I will say, this is talking about while she is a Shomeres Yavam, right? So Reuven is married to Rachel, so Reuven dies without children. Reuven has a brother Shimon. Rachel is waiting to do Yibum with Shimon. If during that time she has relations with another man, what's the prohibition? It's a lav. So Yivam Shibalav Lokoshikin. So what's he here the Kavachomer? If ultimately, again, a married woman who is punishable by chenek for adultery, if when her husband dies, so ultimately the prohibition is removed. So Yivama, when waiting for Yibum, if she who punishable only by a lav, so to speak, she only transgresses a lav, certainly death of the Yavam should remove that lav. Good kavachomer. So the Gemara says, "Male ish." It's not a good kavachomer. I'll tell you why. Male ish ish shekein yotze beget. We'll say ish is different. Why? There's another form of dissolution of this union, which is through a get. Tomar bezu shein yotze beget. The Yivama cannot leave the union with the get. I will say it's very important. As much as we saw, I will say back to our Yivama days. What happens if the Yavam gives the Yivama a get? What happens? What happens? Right. So what it does is it closes the door on Yibum and mandates chalitza. But that's the Rabbanon. That's the Rabbanon. Midaraisa, if a Yavam gives the Yavam a get, it's totally irrelevant. So therefore I will say, the Gemara suggesting the comparison is not a good one, because again, by stama marriage, there is another vehicle of marital dissolution, which does not exist by Yibum. So the Gemara says, Hanami yotze bechalitza. But a second, it's true, whereas the Yavama doesn't go out with a get, but there is another mechanism of dissolution, i.e. chalitza. Elamala ishes ishe kin osra matira. Well, say here's the difference. By an ishes ish, by stama marriage, the same man who asers her is the same man who permits her. So the Gemara will say that is not true. The Havamina is that's not true by Yibum, right? We'll say who's the man who asered Rachel? Who's the man who asered her? Original husband, Ruvain. Who's the man ultimately who permits her? The Yavam, right? Shimon. Ravashi, that's not true. Hanami asram, hanami osra matira, yavam osra, yavam sharila. I will say it's not really true, because even in a Yibum case, at the end of the day, it will say if there's no yavam, right? If Reuven dies without children and there's no surviving brother, what's Rachel's status? Free to marry whoever she wants. The reality is, it is the Yavam himself who prohibits her from marrying other men, and therefore it's the Yavam himself who ultimately, again, through Chalitza, through his death, permits her. So we'll say, so therefore, based on what we're saying over here, the Kal V'chomer seems to be a pretty solid Kal V'chomer. So if by a regular married woman who has a very severe transgression for adultery, the husband, when her husband dies, the prohibition is removed, using that same logic by Yavama, who's only punishable by a lav, when the Yavam dies, the prohibition should be removed as well. Here's the issue. Well, if that Kal V'chomer is going to be right, so we'll say, Sigmar seems to settle on that Kal V'chomer as being good Kal V'chomer. The problem is, if that's the case, we should say that an Eish, a regular married woman, should be able to leave her marriage with Chalitza, based on a Kal V'chomer. It's fascinating. What's Kal V'chomer? Uma Yivama sheni yotze beget yotze v'chalitza. Of a Yivama who cannot leave the Yibum union. I just want to be clear. When we say, once again, that a Yivama cannot leave with a get, remember again, what are we talking about? We're talking about when she is a Shomeres Yavam, right? She's waiting for Yibum, right? That union, that bond, what we call a Zika, right? That Zika cannot be dissolved with a get. So, my Yivama sheni yotze beget yotze v'chalitza, zushi yotze beget, a regular married woman who can't go out with a get, should be able to go out with chalitza as well. An interesting Kal V'chomer. Our Mekra, the pasuk says no, Sefer Krisos. We'll say the pasuk by regular marriage says, how does a woman get divorced? Sefer Krisos. Sefer Karsa, ve'in davar acher Karsa. It is only a document, i.e. a get, that ultimately again dissolves her marriage. Nothing else dissolves her marriage. So if that's the case, let the Yivama leave her Shomeres Yibum status through a get, based on the Kal V'chomer. If a regular married woman cannot dissolve her marriage with chalitza, but yet can dissolve marriage with a get, so certainly again, this one who does leave her marriage ultimately again with chalitza should be able to leave her marriage with a get. Amarkra kacha ikuva. So I will say the pasuk by Chalitza says, Kacha ye'aseh la'ish asher lo yivne es beis achiv. Kacha. We'll say, what does kacha mean? Kacha means this. So the Gemara says, the kacha ikuva. So we'll say, when you see, there are certain lashonos like this in the Torah that indicate to you that there is a there is something is ma'akev, something is indispensable and inexchangeable. So kacha likuva, kacha tells you this is the way that you could dissolve a yibum union and no other way. So it's chalitza, right? Chalitza or bust, right? Again, now it's not just chalitza, it's also death. So we've established, I will say again conclusively, right, that death and chalitza have the ability to dissolve what we know is called this zika. So the Gemara will say, so now the Gemara kind of segues out of this. Now the Torah introduced us, the Gemara just introduced us to this concept that there are certain words that the Torah uses that show you an ikuva, right, an insistence, right, on something materializing in a particular way and in no other way. We call ma'akev. Ma'akev, something is ma'akev. So the Gemara says, one second, now you're telling me therefore that whenever the Torah insists on something, that something is ma'akev, there something has to be a specific way, that thing cannot be part of a kal v'chomer argument. So the Gemara says, listen to this, Rabbi say, listen, very interesting. V'ha Yomi Kippurim, Rabbi say Yom Kippur. And it says our first Yom Kippur sugya in Chodesh Elul. First Yom Kippur sugya in Chodesh Elul. So the Gemara says as follows: V'ha Yomi Kippurim dichsiv goral v'chuka. And I will say, here we go. So remember again, there are two seirim, there are two goats that are offered up as part of the Yom Kippur service, right? So one of them is offered up on the Mizbeach, right? And one of them is pushed off the cliff, right? What we call the seir la Hashem, which is offered up as a carbon, and the seir la Azazel, which is the one pushed off the cliff. Pushed off the cliff. So I will say, now here's what's interesting. Who decides, how do you decide which goat is which? So the Torah says, goral. It's a lottery. It's a lottery. Now I will say, now when the Torah speaks out goral, it uses the lashon of chukah. Now chukah means an everlasting statute. Chukah also means, the Gemara understands to mean, that ultimately what? This is the way that it's done, and you cannot change. In other words, I will say, it must be decided by a lottery. It must be decided by a lottery. In other words, you can't designate anyway, it must be a lottery. The Tanya, we learned, Vasal chatas, chatas. The Torah says you shall make one of the animals a chatas, one of the goats. Hagoral osa chatas, ve'en Hashem chosa chatas. Only a lottery can establish as a chatas designation. I will say shame means verbal designation cannot establish it as a chatas. After all, I would have said shiyachav alodinu. I could have made a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma b'makom shelo kidesh hagoral kidesh Hashem. I will say in other circumstances where you can't use a lottery, verbal designation works. Makom shekidesh hagoral eno din sheikadesh Hashem. Certainly, I will say in a place where lottery does work, certainly what? Verbal designation should work as well. Talmud lomar va'asol chatas hagoral osa chatas ve'en Hashem osa chatas. Therefore, I will say the pasuk says it shall be made a chatas only through the goral. So what you see from here? You see from here that Allah Torah makes an insistence. The Torah makes an insistence that it's only the goral and nothing else. Now the Gemara there says v'taima d'miyat tekra. Now I will say the reason why you can't use verbal designation for the two serim of Yom Kippur and it can only be done through a goral is because the Torah itself has an exclusionary phrase, right? Va'asol chatas. It's only the lottery that makes it a chatas and nothing else. Halav hachi. Were it not for this exclusionary phrase, darshinan kal v'chomer. I could have made a kal v'chomer. Once again, remember what was the kal v'chomer? The kal v'chomer would have been that in other carbonic situations where a goral doesn't work, verbal designation does work, certainly by Yom Kippur, where goral does work, verbal designation certainly work as well. So I will say, so you see from here, it's only because the Torah used a limiting phrase, right, of asol chatos, that she can't apply that kal v'chomer. Can't apply that kal v'chomer. Were it not for that limiting phrase, you could apply a kal v'chomer. Now that's true. Af agav dichsiv bechuka. I will say by Yom Kippur, the Torah uses the lashon of chuka. I will say, what does chuka mean? Chuka is a lashon of ma'akev, that it has to be done this way and no other way. What do you see from here? You see from here that even when the Torah uses a lashon of ikuv, right, a lashon in which it insists a certain way, that doesn't preclude a particular halacha from becoming a source for a kal v'chomer. That contradicts what we just said before. Amar kra, law. So Amakra, so it's fine. So back to what we were saying before. Amakra, law velo liyavama. So I'll say the pasuk says. So going back for just a moment before. So law, when it says the kas of law, sefer krisos. So I'll say going full circle over here. So going back, how do we know therefore that a yavama ultimately again cannot end her marriage ultimately with a get? Pasuk says law law. The kas of law, you have to write for her a get. Law velo liyavama. A regular woman and not for a Yavama. That's how we know that a Yavama cannot end her Zika with a get. I ve'ema law lishma. Maybe law means law lishma. We spent a lot of time on this, right? Law means the get has to be written for the sake of this particular woman, to which the Gemara says, Trey law ksivi. You're right. Torah says law twice. One law is to teach you that a get has to be the Shema. The second is to teach you that get only works dafka for regular marriage, not for Yibum. Not for Yibum. I vakatemi boile chad law lishma v'idach law. V'idach law v'lo law ulechaverta. But still, I need one law to teach me the Shema, and I need another law to teach me what? You cannot use one get for two women. In other words, let's say Reuven is married to two women named Rachel, and now he wants to divorce them both. There's no surprise in that marriage is not working out, right? Two wives, they both have the same name, recipe for disaster, right? So let's say, but he wants to go ahead and use one get. He wants to use one get for both. So that's, law teaches me that no, it's only one get per customer. Ella Amakra. So the Gemara points out, the drush of law can't be the source that a Yavama can't enter marriage or enter bond with a get. Ela Amakra, now. The difference is going full circle. The pasuk says, Nal shu, nal in midi achrini lo. Now we'll say it is dafka a shu, and only a shu, i.e. chalitza, that could end a Yibum relationship and nothing else. But once again, I will say, does that now come to teach me that? That is dafka chalitza that can end a union, nothing else. I need that now for something else. I will say, I need that now for something else. Listen to this great drasha. He says, na'alo, ainli ela na'alo. But say, we're talking about chalitza. The Torah says, ultimately again, that she removes his shoe. Now I will say, now what does na'alo mean? What does his shoe mean? His shoe means dafka, his shoe. So I only know that chalitza can be done with literally, again, the shoe of the yavam. So the Gemara says, now shall call adam in ale. But say, how do you know, technically speaking, you could actually do chalitza with any shoe. Now obviously, the yavam has to be wearing the shoe, right? Shimon, the surviving brother, has to be wearing the shoe. But how do I know it doesn't have to be his shoe? Doesn't have to be his shoe. It could be anyone's shoe used for chalitza. How do I know that? Talmud Lomar, na'al riba. We'll say because the fact that the Torah doesn't phrase it in the possessive, right? Ultimately, again, it says now. So we'll say now comes to teach me any shoe. Any shoe ultimately could be used. Im kein matam lo or nalo. So we'll say here's the problem. It does say nalo. It says both. It says nal and nalo. So now teaches me any shoe. If that's the case, then why does the Torah say it in the possessive as his shoe? Listen to this. Nalo haro'ilo. It has to be a shoe that is fit for him. Meaning what? I want to say last line. Yudal Aleph. Prat legadol she'ein yochol lahalech. This comes to exclude a shoe that is too big for him. Right? I want to say, so it has that he couldn't be able to walk on it. Prat lekatan shein chofa es rov raglo. I will say ultimately again it has to go ahead and exclude a shoe that is too small on him, that wouldn't be able to cover his entire foot. Prat amad beis lemisulim shein lo ekev. Also comes to exclude sandals that do not have a heel. So Rabbi says it's interesting. So this is like the dual drush of na'al na'alo. So na'al teaches us any shoe could be used ultimately again for chalitz. It doesn't have to be a shoe owned by him. Na'alo teaches us that although it doesn't have to be his shoe or a shoe owned by him, it has to be what? A shoe that is wearable by him. So it can't be too big that you couldn't walk on it. It can't be too small that you can't get your foot in it. And it can't be like sandals without a heel, sandals without a heel, which I guess, although they're very fashionable, right? The mice, again, they're not usable. So because they're not usable, that's not called a shoe. Imke nichtov kra na'al. So we'll say if that's the case, then why doesn't the Torah just say na'al? My hanal. What does hanal teach me? Shamas mina tarti teaches me two things. We'll say, what are the two things? Number one, that a yibum relationship can only be ended through na'al, ultimately again through the shoe, right? And number two, that when using a na'al, it has to be the type of shoe, ultimately again, that is fit for him as well. So therefore, the Gemara conclusively proves that Allah Chalamaisa, the Yibum relationship, and again, when we speak about Yibum relationship, we're speaking about when she is a Shomeres Yavam. Because obviously, once Yibum occurs, we'll say, then what? She's a regular married lady, right? So ultimately, again, when she is a shomeres yavam, that union could only be dissolved either through misa sabal, death of the husband or death of the yavam, or ultimately, again, chalitz. Incredible. Also, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. I'll tell you, you're speak about shoes too big. My mother, she should be well, told me that my mother grew up in Vineland, New Jersey. So she was born in the DP camps after the war. So Vineland, New Jersey was a community of many survivors. And my mother remembers that she had a girl in her class. My grandfather, Zichron Livracha, started the Vineland Jewish Day School, which was the first Jewish day school ever in Vineland, New Jersey, after the war. And she had a girl in her class whose parents always bought her shoes which were too big. So what was the pshat? What was the pshat? That the parents were survivors. During the war, right? If you didn't have shoes, you were dead. You were dead, right? Without clothing, you could somehow manage to survive. Without food, somehow you could manage to survive. But shoes, you needed shoes. So the parents, right, who were survivors, lived with this constant fear of the Nazis, Yimach Sham B'Zichram, or some iteration of them reappearing. And they always wanted to make sure that their daughter had shoes. So they always bought her shoes that were too big. In the event that if they had to run, if they had to flee again, they knew that their child would have shoes. Their child would have shoes going forward. So it's interesting, there's a lot of psychology about this, right? About the effect of trauma on next generation. And how, again, people undergo traumatic experiences, they pass down like vestiges of that trauma. So I'll tell you something fascinating, nothing to do with our sugi, but just while I'm mentioning this, I remember when I got engaged, I feel like in Kiddushin I have to clarify, to my first and only wife, right? Right? So I took her to meet to my grandparents. We actually went for Shabbos to my grandparents. And the grandparents also survivors of the war. And my wife asked me, she says, why does your grandmother, it was only my grandmother and grandfather, obviously at the house at that time, said, why does your grandmother has a whole closet filled with towels and fragrant soaps? I always knew, because as a kid, my grandmother always had that. So my wife was like, it's two of them. There's 50 towels in there, right? And enough soap, but fragrant soaps, enough soap. And as you know, when you get used to something, it never. So so my wife asked me, I asked my grandmother, and my grandmother, Zichron Livracha, said something. My grandmother was a survivor of Auschwitz. She says, the filth that they had to live in, and the subhuman conditions that they had to live in. She said, after the war, she said, one of the things that gives me a feeling of comfort is knowing that I could always be clean. That there's always fresh, soft towels, that there's always these fragrant soaps. Such an incredible thing. We don't realize with all the challenges that we have and all the difficulties, and we all have our own challenges. But yet, Baruch Hashem, we are so privileged to live in a time without these types of nisyonos and without these types of churban. It's an incredible thing, but it should also give us an incredible sense of pride of knowing the kind of people we come from, the resiliency of Klal Yisrael. And yet, amazingly enough, you're talking about people who, again, raised, Baruch Hashem, a functional family, Shomrei Torah u'mitzvos, from children, from grandchildren, from great-grandchildren. Kenai Nahara, again, after witnessing the worst churban that the world has ever seen, that Klal Yisrael has ever seen. An incredible thing. Anyway, we'll say, let's go back. I was just thinking about that with the shoes that were too big. The Mishnah says as follows, Eved Ivri, Eved Ivri, Nikna Bekesef Ubishtar, Vikona, so we'll say an Eved Ivri. So we'll say, so now we're transitioning a little bit over here. So remember again, Eved Ivri. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about is there are multiple ways that a person could become an Eved Ivri, right? Either, again, a person could be sold by Beis Din, right? Which generally happens if a person steals and cannot go ahead and repay that which they have stolen. They're sold into servitude to work off their debt, right? Or, Mocher Atzmo, person sells himself. It could happen, and that could be a variety of reasons. That could be a person is destitute, or I will say, or or I don't know. It could even be if a person is lazy, right? You'll say if a person is lazy. We'll say because being a servant essentially again relinquishes the reins of autonomy to someone else, right? You're no longer in charge of your destiny. Many people love to live that way, right? I'm not. Okay, I don't want to be in charge. I'm not in charge. I'm not in charge. Whatever happens, happens. Whatever occurs, occurs. It's very liberating to live that way, but it's also very lazy to live that way. In any event, so the Mishnah says, Eved Ivri. How do you acquire an Eved Ivri? Nikne bekesef, it can be acquired with money. Bishtar, with a document. Vikona es atzmo bishanim, he acquires over the years. I will say, a stam Eved Ivri is sold for 6 years. Sold for 6 years, right? And after 6 years, he goes free. I will say, by the way, I want to be clear, not 6 years Shemitah. It's 6 years whenever he's, and we'll talk about all this. In other words, stam duration of servitude is 6 years, and after 6 years he goes free. Ubi yovel, he goes out yovel as well. We'll discuss all of this. Ubi giraon kesef. We'll say giraon kesef means he could buy his way out. So, for example, an Eved Ivri is sold for a certain amount of money. At any time in the duration of his servitude, he could approach his master and say, "Listen, here's the amount I was sold for minus number of years worked. Here's the money. I'm out." And he could do that with or without the consent of the master. You say Ralav Amaivriya. We'll say now an Amaivriya, a Hebrew maidservant, a Jewish maidservant, has even an additional vehicle of emancipation. Shekonas Atzabi Simonin. We'll say once she goes ahead and she becomes she has Simonim, signs of physical maturation, Naros, ultimately again she goes out free. Hanir tzanik neberitzia. Ultimately, an Eved whose ear is pierced is acquired to his master through the piercing. The kones atzmo biyovel ubemisa sa'adon. He could acquire himself ultimately again during Yovel and through the death of the master. So I will say there's a lot of stuff lumped in here. As one, we're going to have to over the coming days now kind of pull everything out, because as I mentioned before, we're going to see that depending on how the Eved Ivri gets into servitude will determine ultimately again how he gets out and when he gets out. So let's begin to analyze. So Eved Ivri nikna bekesef minalan. So an Eved Ivri is acquired with money. We're doing it. So we'll say, so just to be clear, right? Who are you giving the money to when you acquire an Eved Ivri? Right? So I'm in the market. I would like to acquire a Jewish servant. How do I do it? Right? Who am I giving money to? So there are two possibilities. Possibility one is Beis Din, right? So again, assuming that Reuven stole, he cannot, right? He spent all the money, he has nothing, so now we're going to sell him as a servant to work off his debt. In that case, I'm essentially purchasing the Eved from Beis Din. Beis Din will then take the money and give the money to the aggrieved party. Okay. Other possibility is what we call mocher es atzmo Mocher es atzmo machmas dochak is someone who sells himself because he's impoverished. Then I will say, who's getting the money? Who's getting the money? The Eved. Right? So in that case, again, I'd be giving the money to the Eved and ultimately acquiring him like that. So Eved Ivri nikra bekesef minalan. How do we know that an Eved Ivri is acquired with money? So Amakra, the pasuk says mikesef miknaso. So I will say the pasuk. Now I will say, now this is actually interesting. The pasuk says im older rabbos pashanim lefien yashav glos mikesef miknaso. Now I will say, now, interestingly enough, this is actually talking about if a Jewish person was sold to a Gentile master, there is an obligation upon his relatives to redeem him from that servitude. How do you redeem him? Very simple. You look at the purchase price. Purchase price usually is amount for a certain number of years of servitude. See how long he has worked, and then give the master the remaining amount. So both say the fact that the Torah says mikesef miknaso tells us that ultimately, again, that the Eved himself, mikesef means from the amount of money he was acquired for. So you see over here that an Eved Ivri is acquired with money. But Ashkechon eved ivri nimkar la'ovid kochavim. Now I will say, now that pasuk is talking about a Jewish servant sold to a Gentile master. So I will say, because again, in general, the way a Gentile acquires things is through kesef. So I will say, so remember, the Gemara is trying to say, you see the Torah use lashon mikesef miknaso, that if you want to redeem the Jewish servant from his Gentile master, how do you do it? You look at kesef miknaso. How much did the Gentile master buy him for? How many years has he worked? And then pay off the master the remaining amount. So the fact that using kesef miknaso shows that the Adon acquired his servant through kesef. That's fine, but that's by a Gentile master. How do I know ultimately again? Nimkar li yisomin. How do I know that if a Jewish servant is sold to a Jewish master, that the Jewish master could acquire him with kesef as well? Amrakra vehefda. Rabbi says it's actually interesting. The Torah speaks about again. This is by an Amma Ivriya. An Amma Ivriya. Now, Rabbi say Amma Ivriya is even more interesting because by a Jewish maidservant there is a biblical expectation that if you acquire a Jewish maidservant, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be marrying her. You're marrying her. So the Torah says that if you don't want to marry her, ultimately, again, right? Redeemer. So by let her be brought out of the servitude. Vehefta melamed shemegaras pidyona v'yotza. What does that teach us? It teaches us that she has the ability to go ahead and buy her way out. That also teaches us that the master has an obligation to diminish the buyout amount to a point that she can go ahead and get out. Now, we'll talk about that more separately. But the point I will say is that megaras pidyona vehefta means she redeems. Redeems teaches us that she buys herself out of her contract, which means that ultimately, how did she get into this in the first place? Money. So you see from here that a master could acquire an Amma Ivriya with money. So the Gemara says, Ashkechan Amma Ivriya, Ho'il Makacha Bekesef, Mikna Bekesef. Now we'll say an Amma Ivriya. So if I'm an Amma Ivriya, she could be acquired by money. But Amma Ivriya might not be the right proof. Why? Because we'll say, interestingly enough, the Amma Ivriya, if the master chooses to go ahead and marry his Amma Ivriya, let's say, interesting enough, he doesn't have to give her additional kesef kiddushin, right? Why? Because the purchase money essentially goes towards the kesef kiddushin. So an Amma Ivriya, who ultimately again could be betrothed by kesef, could be acquired as an Amma Ivriya by kesef as well. Eved Ivri, so we'll say still Eved Ivri. How do I know? How do I know that a Jewish servant acquired by a Jewish master has the ability to be acquired by money or through money? Amar so we'll say it's very simple. Ki yimkar lecha achicha ha'ivri o ha'ivriya va'avdecha sheish shanim. The Torah says if your brother the Ivri or Ivriya or your sister the Ivriya will be sold to you, they should work for you for 6 years. Makish Ivri le'Ivriya. The Torah goes in and compares a Jewish servant to a Jewish maidservant. And just as we established that a Jewish maidservant can be acquired with money, so to a Jewish servant can be acquired with money as well. Perfect. So Ashkechan Machru Bezdin. I will say, I know that a Jewish servant can be acquired by money or through money in a case of someone who was sold by Bezdin. Sold by Bezdin, right? Because he was sold against his will. Now take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi is, if you go across in Rashi where we are in the Gemara, about 5 lines down, Machru Bezdin, Big Nevaso, Yimkar al Yedei Achire Mashma. So the pasuk that we're dashing over here of Ki Yimkar, if your brother will be sold, we'll say brother will be sold sounds like what? Being sold by another party. Who's the only other party you could sell a Jew? Bezdin. So now I know that if you have a Jewish servant sold by Bezdin to a Jewish master, ultimately again, he can be sold with money. He can be acquired with money. How do I know that if a Jewish servant sells himself, that he can be acquired with money as well? Yoliv Sachir. We will say we dash an Gzer Shava of Sachir. Sachir, Rashi says over here, Sachir, Ne'emar b'mocher atzmo kimoch achicha v'nimkar, kisachir kitoshav yemach, v'nimachru ha'bezin. So we'll say, the Torah uses the same lashon of Sachir, which means like a hired worker, right? You start the same lashon of Sachir by a Jew sold by Bezdin and a Jew selling himself. So therefore that Gzer Shav allows us to link the two. So just as we know that when a Jew is sold by Bezdin to another Jew, ultimately, again, it can be acquired with money. So too, if a Jew sells himself to another Jew, ultimately it can be acquired with money. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Hani chalaman do yoliv sachir sachir." That works fine if you dash in that gzera shava. However, elaman do lo yoliv sachir sachir ma'ikal meimar. I will say if you don't dash in that if you don't dash in that gzera shava, because also remember again, in order to dash in a gzera shava, you have to have a masor, you have to have a tradition for it. Apparently, we're going to see later on that there was a school of thought that they didn't dash in this sachir sachir. So what do you do with that? Ma'ikal meimar amar kra v'chi sasig. Also, the pasuk says v'chisasig. Now the rest of the pasuk is v'chisasig yad ger v'toshav imach umach achichem v'nimkar leger toshav imach o le'eker mishpachas ger v'chisasig mosef al inyan rishon v'yelamed elyon mitachton. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, look at Rashi v'chisasig b'mocher atzol v'kochavim. Rabbi say, now that pasuk of v'chisasig is talking about a Jew who, because he's down on his luck, ultimately again sells himself, or he's just impoverished. He sells himself to a Gentile. Okay, that's the case here. Now say, now that pasuk is juxtaposed with samchua the parshas mocher atzmo liyisrael the yilma nimkar liyisrael nimkar la'ovid kochavim be'akesha. So Rabbi say, ultimately again, so now because they're juxtaposed, just like we know that a Gentile master could acquire a Jew with money, we already established that. So the juxtaposition teaches us that ultimately, again, even when a Jew sells himself, he can allow himself to be acquired with money as well. Incredible. Uman tanadol yoliv sachir sachir. So both say, so now, just to be clear, here's what we've established: that a Jewish servant, whether he's being sold to an akum, right, a non-Jew, getting tangled up here, right, whether he's sold to a non-Jew, right, or whether ultimately again Beis is selling him, or whether he is selling himself, has the ability to be acquired by money. Now we've established. Good. So that's period. Fact number one. Now the Gemara goes back. So we'll say, so remember again, who is the Tana who does not subscribe to the Gzera Shava of Sachir? We'll say, remember again, the Sachir is, it says, but when it says in the case of a Jew who sells himself, Torah is lashon of Sachir, and ultimately again of a Jew, who, and in the case of a Jew who's sold by Beis Din. So Sachir. So the first thing he wanted to say, the same way that a Jew sold by Beis Din can be acquired by money, so too a Jew who sells himself can be acquired by money as well. But that only works if you adopt the Gzer Shava of Sachir. But apparently there's someone who doesn't hold of that Gzer Shava. Who doesn't hold of that Gzer Shava? So the Gemara says, watch this. Hi Tano, this is very interesting. Hamoch Rabbi say, now this brisa is a fascinating brisa that is going to really serve as the basis for our discussion in tomorrow's daf as well. So here we go. This anya. Hamocha atzmo. When a Jew sells himself into servitude, nimkar l'sheish v'yesra al sheish. You're sold for automatically 6 years or more than 6 years. And I will say, what does that mean? The minimum duration of an Eved Ivri is 6 years. But if you want, you could enter into a longer arrangement. So in other words, if Ruvain wants to sell himself to me, and we want to agree on a tenure of 10 years, we could do that. So six is the floor. 6 is the floor, but ultimately, again, you could negotiate a higher duration if you would like. Machru Beis Din, however, when an Eved is sold by Beis Din, Eino Nimkar El L'Sheish. If you're sold by Beis Din, Rabbi say, 6 years and that's it. 6 years and that's it. You cannot negotiate a longer term. Hamocher Atzmo, if a person sells himself, Eino Nirtza, can't get your ear pierced, which Rabbi say means what? If the Eved wants to stay past the initial duration, he may not. Whatever you negotiate, 6 years floor, but afterwards you cannot stay on. Machru Beis Din Nirtza. But ultimately, again, if an Eved is sold by Beis Din, I will say, we'll explain all of this. If an Eved is sold by Beis Din, ultimately, again, he can have his ear pierced, i.e., he could stay on longer. Good, next. Mocha atzmo, we'll say when a person sells himself into servitude, ein ma'anikin lo. We'll say we will see there's this concept of hanaka. Hanaka means that when an Eved Ivri goes free, the master is obligated to give him I guess what we would call startup capital. Startup capital, right? Gifts. I'm sorry? Departing gifts. But I will say, it's fascinating. We'll discuss why it is, but it's fascinating. Even though this guy has worked, and Bipashtas again, he's not working for free. Lemaisa, when he leaves servitude, you have an obligation to give him from, again, your livestock, from your grain, from your wine, from your so on and so forth. So I will say, so ultimately, when a guy sells himself into servitude, no hanaka. Machrua bezdin manikim lo. Ultimately, if you're sold by Beis Din, ultimately you do get hanaka. Hamocher, again, we're going to discuss these distinctions. Hamocher atzmo, ein rabo moselo shifcha kinanis. When a guy sells himself into servitude, I will say, the master cannot give him a Gentile maidservant. I will say, why would the master give the Jewish servant a Gentile maidservant? Why? Procreation. Remember again, the kids they have will be servants. So this is an easy way for the master to go ahead and increase his workforce. If you sell yourself into servitude, the master cannot give that type of eved a Gentile maidservant. Machru Beis Din, if he's sold by Beis Din, ultimately Moser lo shifcha kinanis. Ultimately, again, the master can give him a shifcha kinanis. Rabbi Elazar says, that's the Tanakama. So Rabbi say Tanakama's view is making all of these distinctions between Mocher Atzmo versus Machru Beis Din. Guy sells himself versus a guy sold by Beis Din. Comes along Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says no. Zev zeh eino nimkar l'sheish. Rabbi Elazar says not true. Whether you're Mocher Atzmo or Machru Beis Din, 6 is the maximum duration. You are sold for a tenure of 6 years and no more. V'zeh v'zeh nirtza. If you want to stay on, both can stay on, and both get their ears pierced then for a duration up until Yovel. V'zeh v'zeh manikim lo. And both Machru Beis Din and Mocher Atzmo, when they leave servitude, get hanaka, get these gifts from the master. V'zeh v'zeh rabo moser lo shifcha kinanis. And I will say both are able to go ahead and be given a female, a Gentile maidservant for procreation purposes for the master. So I will say essentially what Rabbi Elazar says is there is no difference between an Eved who comes into servitude because he sold himself versus an Eved who was ultimately sold by Beis Din. Tanakama makes all of these distinctions. Rabbi Elazar makes none of these things. Says the Gemara, Maila b'hakam iflagi. So what are they arguing about? The Tanakama, lo yoliv sacher sacher. Rabbi Elazar yoliv sacher sacher. So we'll say, what's the machlokes? It's very simple, very simple. Rabbi Elazar holds of the gzera shava of sacher sacher. Rabbi Elazar, what's the gzera shava of sacher sacher? It says sacher by mocher atzmo, the Eved who sells himself, and it says sacher by machrua Beis Din, by an Eved sold by Beis Din, to teach you what? Their halachas are the same. And therefore, Rabbi Elazar makes no distinction by either type of these avadim. Tanakama does not hold of this gzera shava, and therefore two different bodies of halacha for the servant who sells himself versus the servant ultimately again, versus the servant who is sold by Beis Din. Arav Tevim Sheda Abaye, no. To kuli alma yoliv sacher sacher v'hacha b'krai kamiflagi. The Gemara says not true, not true. Everyone agrees with the gzera shava of sacher sacher. So what's going on? Everybody say, what is the point of contention? The point of contention is how to dash in psukim. So everybody say, we will stop over here for today. So just understand, tomorrow, big stuff coming up tomorrow. Big stuff. So everybody say, so now, by the way, you see, this is the machlokes. You see, essentially see Rabbi Elazar saying there is no halachic distinction between an Eved who sold himself versus an Eved sold by Beis Din. Tanakama is saying there is a world of difference between these avadim. We thought originally that it's based on whether or not you dash in the gzera shava of sacher. Kamash Molono, everyone agrees with that gzera shava. So wherein lies the machlokes? The machlokes ultimately again is going to be in dashing psukim abozai, to be continued tomorrow. What a magnificent start of the week. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Shkoyach. Schus with all of you.